Welcome back to the agenda with your Missoula County Commissioners. I'm Juanita Vero, and I'm here with my fellow commissioners, Dave Strohmeyer and Josh Slotnick, and Josh is running a little late, so he might pop in. But we're joined today by Grace Decker, who wears many hats and currently works as the coordinator of the Montana Advocates for Children. So welcome, Grace.
Yes, welcome, Grace. I think we first met when my kids, went to Missoula Community School way back in the day. And so there's probably been a lot of twists and turns in your career and experience since then. So maybe just talk to us a little bit about your past experience as it relates to just working with kids and how you ended up where you are today.
Thank you so much. And I am so glad that you mentioned that I was lucky enough to have your kids when I was working as the director at the Missoula Community School, which was a minute ago. I've worked in early childhood for my entire career, and the reason why really is because of the joy and love of kids and how fascinating I've always found that early childhood period of life. And I was lucky enough to work at a school where we really celebrated that joy and building that community and loved the work that we did. To be honest, the longer that I was there, the more I started to realize that across the community, not every kid had access to that great and joyful and exploratory kind of a start. And I started to realize that what I really wanted to do was work to try to make sure that more and more kids could have access to a great early childhood education. So across the course of the last 20 years, I worked as a coach and a consultant to other childcare programs, offering them training and then being there to answer their questions, especially around challenging behavior in young children, which is something that I'm really passionate about.
Does that ever happen?
And by the way, this is Commissioner Josh Slotnick, who just showed up. He was dropping his kids off at Childcare, I believe.
Exactly. Sorry to be tardy, but I'm very glad to be here, and thanks for joining us.
I'm so glad to be here with all of you, yeah. And yes, challenging behavior happens all the time. In fact, there are two reasons why people tend to leave the early childhood field. One is because the wages are so low, and we'll get to that. But the other is because dealing with challenging behavior is something that a lot of educators haven't had training and preparation for when they work in childcare settings or preschool settings. So a lot of people do leave because of challenging behavior. It's a reality. Yeah. So I started to realize that not everybody had a great start. And so I've worked in community building and systems building since then. And after I left my roles coaching and consulting, I was at Childcare Resources, I moved over to 0 to 5 Missoula, where I got to spend 5 really wonderful years working on like our childcare system and our early learning system across the community.
Is there something unique about investing in early childhood as opposed to investing in free community college or higher teacher wages for high school, something?
Yeah. Well, brains are built between birth and 5. If you invest
We're out of luck, Josh.
Damn.
Yeah.
But say more about brains
I
being
threw that
built.
softball to you intentionally.
Yeah. Well, it's a softball, but you would think it'd be common knowledge, right? But still
But what do you
true.
mean by, brains are being built? Like,
Yeah. So
what component?
everything. People's capacity for the learning and development that take place over the rest of their life is really built in those first couple of years. And babies are born with all of the neurons that they need to develop. But those neurons only make connections to each other based on the experiences that they're exposed to in those early years. So the more enriching experiences, the right kinds of experiences, responsive experiences from adults who aren't stressed out. That's the magic sauce. Responsive back and forth interaction with adults who aren't stressed out. And if young babies, young children get enough of those, they develop all the capacities that they are going to need for literacy, for physical development, and importantly, for communication and for self-regulation. Remember the challenging behavior, right? So if they haven't learned those self-regulation skills by the time they start school, it's much, much, much harder to retrofit those skills later in life. So what happens birth to 5 really matters. And so what we do for kids birth to 5 pays off.
What does the data say about the sort of dollar payback from investing in little kids as opposed to investing in other groups?
Yeah. Well, we can talk about it in terms of dollars. I do first want to talk about it in terms of human potential, because a person who is able to self-regulate, that's actually a different kind of generational wealth. They grow to be adults who are able to solve problems, to be capable and empathetic individuals who contribute to their communities, they're civically engaged. There are just many, many, many measures. Okay, so let's put that aside, because I know you all care about that too. The money. Economists, they have tried to figure out the dollars. And folks say that anywhere from $7 to $18 is returned to the community for every dollar invested in early childhood. The trick of that, though, is that those are dollars that we don't spend later primarily. Yes, people tend to, make more money, be more creative, be more entrepreneurial, all of those things if they've had a great start. So there are some actual dollars, but it's opportunity costs, and we don't spend money on things like special education as much when children get what they need early. We don't spend as much money on the carceral system and on criminal justice, and we don't spend as much money on addiction programs, and we don't spend as much money on healthcare services because, you want to talk about what happens in early childhood and whether it matters later? Have you heard the news about trauma?
Yeah.
Because it turns out that not only those really positive serve and return, back and forth positive interactions in early childhood, those result in developing what you do need. But it turns out that toxic experiences in early childhood result in measurable impacts later in life. So children who have experienced ongoing trauma in their early years are much more likely later in life to have cancer, high blood pressure, to have heart disease, to have diabetes.
To have toxic relationships.
Yes, and a lot of the kind of behaviors that you would expect too. But people really often expected that challenging childhood, challenging adult behaviors, right? It's a learned pattern or they're self-soothing. But what people didn't expect is that trauma is actually written into the body in the way that the body develops its systems. Because being in a heightened state of arousal, so stressed all the time in ways that you can't escape and no one is there to help you recover from when you're really, really little, that changes your physical body. So that later in life, those negative health outcomes are much more likely to be seen in people who had traumatic experiences early on. The study that really unpacked all of this was called the ACEs study. It was done in California. A lot of folks have started to get the word about it.
Childhood experiences.
Yes, you've got it. Yeah. And so what really surprised folks was not so much the this is a ridiculous way to say it, but not so much the drug addiction and the toxic relationships, but the diabetes and the cancer and the heart disease, right?
Why do you think it is, I've got some hunches, but why it is so much easier for many folks to embrace investing in those way downstream effects like the criminal justice system than early childhood investments that clearly pay
You just
dividends?
think magically the mother is going to know exactly how to do this.
And I guess secondly, along those lines, have you found any particularly compelling ways to make the case?
Yeah. Well, one thing that I'll say is that the United States is an outlier in this regard. Most of our peer nations spend many multiples as much on children between the ages of birth and 3 as we do. So most of our peer wealthy nations around the world are spending anywhere from $11,000 to $21,000 per year per child between the ages of birth and 3. And that's on things like paid family leave. It's on things like universal access for low cost to childcare services, universal access to pre-K services, as well as all kinds of other investments in playgrounds and parks that are designed well for young children and public transportation services that work well for young children and the people who are caring for them. So anybody want to make a guess how much the United States spends per child
Say
birth?
the numbers again.
Anywhere from $11,000 to $21,000 in our peer nation. So how much do you think we spend?
1,000.
6,000.
2,000.
You're all way high.
Whoa!
Oh, man.
Holy
I was going to
smokes!
say 0, but okay.
Approximately $500.
Oh my
Whoa.
gosh, it's painful.
It's embarrassing.
So, Grace, the countries that you're describing that really put a substantial investment into 0 to 5, do they correspondingly spend less in terms of human development as people are older? Because if they made this investment early, then they don't need to spend so much money on incarceration and diabetes treatment and addiction treatment, et cetera.
Often when folks are doing sort of nation-to-nation comparisons, they might not necessarily unpack that specific question. But when you look at the happiest countries in the world, the countries that are spending in those
What's a
ways
happy
show
country?
up on that list, like Finland, like
Denmark,
the Scandinavian
Sweden,
countries.
Bhutan.
Yes. In terms of national happiness, gross national happiness, those are the countries that are outpacing us, if it were a competitive thing, right? But so the countries that are spending more on early childhood have those outcomes. They also typically have much more egalitarian situations in terms of women in the C-suite, for example, women in government, for example. Yeah, there's a reason for that, right? Because the United States has such a fragile social safety net that our social safety net is women.
Yeah.
In fact, a book that I had read over the past summer was called Holding It Together. It's by Jessica Calarco. She interviewed 4,000 families and spent hundreds and hundreds of hours talking to families about their situations and about sort of who keeps all the pieces together. Her conclusion is that America runs on women.
I heard an interesting thing the other day. It was if you're an aging person like Juan, not like me and Dave, fear of being in some soulless, toxic, carpeted, fluorescent lit, assisted living
Like this,
situation.
it's just like this very room that
this
we're in
very
today. Yeah.
What's the number one thing you can do to prevent finding yourself in such a situation? Is have a daughter.
Gut punch, honestly. That's
the thing. When you said women hold it together, absolutely. That's the deal.
And, women hold it together in the early years too. Because even though today 2/3 of children have all available adults in their lives who are in the workforce, the situation is that most children have all adults in their home life, their family, are working in some way. And yet, when childcare is hard to find, or too expensive for a family to access easily, the resolution of that, not every single time, but the vast majority of the time, is that the woman in that partnership alters her career aspirations and alters her work situation so that family safety net is protected in some way. And many women did that.
It's kind of a hidden tax.
It is a hidden tax, and there's been some really fascinating research on this from the Center for American Progress. There's a depressing calculator. We could include the link to it in the materials for this podcast, but the depressing calculator will let you know the lost income over your lifespan from taking even a single year out of the workforce to care for children. And
Wonder how it goes for caring for. I don't have children, but I have aging parents.
Yes.
So
It
I'm
happens
wondering.
later.
Yeah.
Unless you were
Yeah.
had old parents early. I don't know. I guess that's
Yeah.
That would be me.
That would be yeah.
I think part of the challenge is that it does happen early.
Yeah.
Because
when you're-
people
when
have-
you're
And then
scrapping.
your career is stunted.
Right.
Yep.
Not only is your career maybe held because you've missed out on those training and promotion opportunities, but your opportunity to invest in your retirement at that particularly
Sure.
critical starting out stage is also really restricted by that. And so I'll often share this calculator with folks to say, women are holding it together right now, but that is an invisible cost that families are paying. Because of the way our system works, the family individually is paying a cost later for having made that choice.
Yeah, I was
earlier.
calling it a hidden tax because tax money is typically used for things that help the greater good. And having stable families and healthy children and high-functioning adults certainly helps the greater good. And if a person is able to take the time out of work to make sure their kids are smart and stable and well-adjusted and kind and good, then we all benefit. So it is a tax, but it's a tax only borne, as you're saying, mostly by women.
Yeah, and it's a tax that we don't really recognize as a social responsibility in the same way that we recognize, say, responsibility to children after the age of 5. After the age of 5, we guarantee to every child in Montana that there will be a safe and enriching place where they will spend their days, 180 days a year for like 6 hours a day, at no cost at the point of service to the parent. Before that time, families are essentially completely on their own. There are federal programs to try to make care a little more affordable for families, but those have historically been really hard to access. The qualification for that is far below the level of many families who they make too much money to qualify, but childcare takes an enormous whack out of what their monthly budget looks like. In fact, for most families, childcare, especially if you have more than one child, is your largest expense, even larger than your mortgage or your rent in many cases.
So I've heard childcare referred to as a failed market economy.
Absolutely.
What do you think is meant by that?
It means that the consumer, if you will, the family, cannot afford to pay the cost of what the service costs to create.
And how about the workers in the situation? How well are they paid?
Remember when I said that there were two reasons why people leave the field,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
One of them was the challenging behavior, and that's real, but the major reason is the wages. Wages in
So-
childcare are still hovering in Montana between $11.50 and about $14.50 an hour.
So it costs way too much for the consumer, and the workers don't get paid very well. So
Correct.
the market economy here isn't working. I heard someone in Congress, I can't remember who it was, but it was a Republican, say his mind was changed on childcare when he started thinking about it like commodity agriculture. So if we want to have cheap bread and pasta, we have to subsidize wheat. So it works. Right? Farmers stay afloat, at least just barely, but it works. And we have some of the cheapest food in the whole world. So if we start thinking about childcare in the same way.
But then the quality of the wheat, how do you...
So that's a different, you're mixing the metaphors. Sorry.
Okay.
So if you do use the same paradigm in childcare, and said, okay, we're going to federally subsidize childcare, and then the consumer doesn't pay so much, like you don't pay so much when you buy bread, and the producer actually earns enough to live. The folks who are workers now get paid $20 an hour. So it becomes a market economy that meets the needs of both the producer and the consumer, putting quality aside, which is exactly what we've done with commodity agriculture. It's why milk and bread and sugar are cheap.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting and good way to look at it. I do want to emphasize the quality piece, though, in that right now, the only place where people can really strip away is in that quality component. And I think we all would agree that there is such a thing as childcare that is of low enough quality that none of us would choose it for our own children. And so what that virtuous cycle of treating it as an important commodity would look like has to pay attention to the quality piece, because part of what makes childcare so different from other businesses is that it's not simply possible to produce more of said product in order to sell more of it. That really doesn't work. There's not a way to scale that maintains the quality for what's going on for kids.
And it's worth adding that when we are looking at folks who are caring for some of our most vulnerable family members, it's on both ends of the age spectrum. So think about my own mother who spent time in a memory care facility and seeing the folks who were tending to her needs also seriously underpaid.
Yeah,
so.
for sure. And I didn't mean to applaud our food system in terms of quality. There's dissertations of information that could be described about the hidden costs there, and I want to be sure and acknowledge that. I'm just talking about consumers paying less and producers getting paid more, and this only happens because of an injection of subsidy. Maybe a similar model could happen in childcare, but hopefully with better results in terms of quality.
So what do you think?
More about Montana Advocates for Children in this initiative. What is that?
Yeah, well, Montana Advocates for Children is a coalition of 11 statewide organizations who are all interested in building a better childcare system. And some of the organizations who are part of MAC are early childhood organizations like the Head Start Association and 0 to 5 Montana and the Family Childcare Network and the Montana Association for the Education of Children. Those are all early childhood players. And some are folks who are working more in the kind of economic justice space, folks like Montana Women Vote and the Montana Budget and Policy Center. That's actually where MAC is fiscally anchored as well. And all of those organizations together are really concerned with trying to build a better funded and better coordinated early care and education system that any Montana family can access who wants it. So we have outlined some policy priorities, some levers at the state legislature that could make a difference. But the long-term goal really is to build a system that has a sustainable funding source to do exactly what you're talking about, Josh, to bring resources into the system that weren't there before. That's another way to say subsidize, right? So bring resources in. We can talk too about some cool examples of communities bringing resources in new ways.
What are some of those levers that could be pulled at the legislature?
Well, let's talk about the legislature first. So one of them is that last year in 2023, the legislature for the first time made a state investment in the child care scholarship program beyond what is required, the very bare minimum that's required by the feds. So most of the money that goes into the child care subsidy that families use, low-income families, to access and pay for child care, most of that money is federal dollars coming into the state and then deployed by Department of Public Health. The state legislature is required to have some amount of state match. And most states, we're an outlier in Montana, most states have committed additional resources alongside that required match for many years. Montana has not. And for the first time it did in order to expand the set of families who would be eligible for the scholarship. So that's really a step on the right road. And we want to continue to push to see that happen up to the federal max. The federal max would be up to 250% of federal poverty. Families making up to $68,000, a 3-person family, would be able to access some help with their child care costs.
What would that help look like?
That help would look like capping their family copay. Currently, the federal required cap is 8% of their income. And then in a couple of years, that drops down to 7%. So that family would be required to pay no more than 7% on childcare, family making $68,000 of a family of 3. Right now, we are at 180% of poverty. So a family would have to make significantly less than $68,000 in order to qualify. So we want to continue to push that envelope wider and wider because it's really one of the best tools that we have to make childcare affordable. The other piece that we really want to push for is to make sure that people who work in childcare are able to access the Best Beginning Scholarship for their own kids. Because right now, folks who work in childcare, well, I mentioned the low wages and I mentioned the challenging behavior. The other thing that happens is that when folks have their own kids, they then have to pay for childcare themselves in order to continue to do that work. And maybe they have a partner whose income puts them over the limit. And they have to make that choice. Do I keep doing work that I really enjoy, even though my entire paycheck goes to pay for the childcare that's in the same program where I'm working? So other states have begun to explore categorical eligibility for the Child Care Scholarship for people who work in childcare. And we think it would be a really great attractant for folks into a field that is severely understaffed right now. Turnover in childcare is upwards of 75% of staff typically across the field.
Over a year? What time frame? Wow.
In a year. And that means that people aren't building expertise. Yeah. They have no mentors. They have no guides to look to who have expertise in the field. So that categorical eligibility would actually be a really significant lever for a fairly small cost because we're only talking about a couple thousand child care workers in the state. So we think that would be a really interesting way to explore that.
We've been talking a little bit about state government. Is there work from a policy perspective that is currently afoot or that needs to happen at the federal level too? And then eventually let's come
we're going to talk about the local level too, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
This doesn't feel like a local issue or a state issue. It's the whole darn country.
Well, it's impacting the whole country. But the reality is that we can't wait for a big, giant, massive new federal program in order to start making improvements where we can in our system. And so that's why it's really important that we pay attention to any state levers that exist and really creative local solutioning. And I want to talk about that too.
Let's talk about that then. Yeah, absolutely.
So there have been a couple of really great examples over the past few years of projects at the local level across the state of Montana. For example, in Baker, in Fallon County, a group of folks came together to try to convince all the residents of Fallon County that childcare was what they needed to do. And the residents of Fallon County put childcare on the ballot as a bond initiative.
And for folks who don't know, this is southeast Montana.
Yes. Yeah. It didn't pass.
Okay.
Did it come close?
It was not super close. But the thing is,
it was just
it was a horrible failure.
No,
actually.
This was just the first run at it.
This was the first run at it.
It takes time to educate folks and.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. The fact of the matter is that in order to get a bond measure on the ballot at all requires signatures from a significant number of people across that county. And those folks have not dropped the issue of childcare. They're continuing to explore it, continuing to work on it. Childcare was not on the radar as a countywide issue 5 years ago. So that's actually a really huge win to get the conversation elevated to that level. And sometimes I think we are too quick to look for like those quick wins where we went all the way, insert sports metaphor here.
Yeah. Well said.
Is this emblematic of, oftentimes we hear about, and legitimately so, an urban-rural divide in the state of Montana, and throughout America for that matter. Is what you saw play out in Fallon County similar to what you might suspect elsewhere in the state of Montana, or is the challenge with getting something like that over the finish line equally difficult in urban areas?
It's a great question, and I think this is one of those pieces where engaging stakeholders like who didn't used to think about childcare is such an important part of the equation. I'll tell you about a different example from rural Montana in Dutton. The school district in Dutton was struggling to staff up with teachers, with its own workforce. And like a lot of small communities, housing's a challenge and childcare was a huge challenge. How could you find teachers to work in the school when their own kids had nowhere to go and spend the day? Well, the town of Dutton opened a childcare in its own school building in order to provide childcare for its own staff. So
teachers bring kids to school.
The teachers bring their kids right to school with them. They're being cared for right down the hallway. DeSmet School, right out by the airport here in Missoula, as I think you all know, is working on a sort of mixed housing development apartment right adjacent to their school. And building a childcare purpose-built on that space has been part of his plan since the get-go. So that's a pretty exciting opportunity right here in Missoula that he's pursuing. And then there's Childcare Advantage, which I want to talk about. Yeah. So Childcare Advantage is a Missoula-born solution, right? It was born right here in Missoula to try to bring sectors together who weren't paying attention to childcare before very much. So Childcare Advantage is a network of independent childcare businesses. Those businesses are networked together by shared services, which reduce their operating costs and also bring them more income, because one of the shared services is a wait list that keeps them full 100% of the time, which is actually really important in a childcare small business to be full 100% of the time. So these 6 networked small businesses are co-located in renovated classrooms at Cold Springs School. And in order to make all of that work, the folks who came together also identified businesses who wanted to be members. So local companies in the Missoula area, Clearwater Credit Union and Partners in Home Care, became members in the network. Their employees find childcare faster by looking for it in the network. The waitlist advantages their employees. So you think about all of the different partners that I just rattled off in that 45-second description. We're talking about the school district at the table. We're talking about independent corporations in our community who are at the table. We're talking about the nonprofit community, because this was really incubated by United Way and 0 to 5 Missoula while I was working there. We're talking about independent childcare businesses being at the table and part of that process. They're not usually connected to any network like this.
Missoula County helped fund this project.
And that's the big finale. Missoula County and the city of Missoula. Actually,
is there a city?
What county is that city in?
I don't know if we haven't incorporated.
So the city and county each were able to add a relatively small but significant investment in the coordination of this project in their budgets, which helps this project be sustainable. The goal then is to expand that network outward to more and more independent childcare businesses so that more and more companies can join. Now, they're not going to literally be co-located at Cold Springs. This is a virtual network of the back office shared services.
So how does this model address the 2 economic problems we identified before? One, costs too much for consumers and producers don't get paid enough. How does this model address those 2 things?
So what this model does is that it brings those independent childcare businesses more income without having to charge the parents who are paying tuition more.
How so?
Because they are saving time and money, and they are making more income by staying full 100% of the time.
And they share back office.
Yeah, the back
personnel.
office, not even personnel, but virtual
Functions?
services mostly. Yeah, back office functions. So the major functions that they share are payroll services on the back end. They have access to telehealth services for their staff. And then the piece that makes them the most money is the wait list. So right now, if you're looking for childcare as a parent, you have to yourself call bumpteen different providers and be told no and be put on their wait lists. So you might literally, as a parent, be on a wait list for 20 childcare facilities. Some of those facilities might even charge you a fee in order to be on the wait list. Now, looking at it from the other side, if you're a provider, at the end of your long day, you've worked for 8 or 10 or 12 hours with children. Remember the challenging behaviors.
Yeah.
You've done that all day, and now you're looking at your phone and you've got bumpteen phone calls that you need to return and say, no, I'm sorry, do you want to get on our wait list? No, I'm sorry, do you want to get on our wait list? So our wait list process is sort of like Match.com for childcare, right? So folks are swiping one way and the other, and a likely match pops up, and then provider and parent together figure out if it's a mutually agreeable match. But all of that time for both of those folks is cut out of the equation. Now, in the first model, where the provider is having to make all those calls and put people on the wait list, when someone they are caring for tells them, hey, Johnny's last day is going to be next Friday, we're moving to Delaware. Now the provider has to go back through that whole wait list and try to find someone who's a good match for that spot. Those folks have either found care somewhere else, they've moved to Alaska, the kid's now 3 and is no longer a good fit for an infant spot. All of these things, so that spot might, even though we're in a shortage situation, that spot might sit open for weeks until that person is ready to come in and be a paying customer.
Sounds like such a good job for technology.
This is a technology solution, right? There's no person sitting there fielding the calls. That's what's so cool about it. And it actually does saves the parent a ton of time. It saves the provider a ton of time. And because they will probably find a match before that child even has their last day, they don't lose a day of income. And we're talking about childcare businesses that are serving 6 children, maybe?
So if they
10
lose
children?
one kid one day is a big deal.
One kid one day, especially one kid 1 week or 1 month. Now that's a significant percentage of their go-round.
So
Is there savings on lease or rental because of the sort of shared real estate?
Yes, in the pilot. So the location at Cold Springs is a pilot for the network. And the providers who are there also have a very reasonable rent situation because of the partnership of the district. We would love to find other buildings owned by school districts, owned by county government, city government, and some other sorts of supports for renovating those. We had a state grant during the ARPA dollars days in order to renovate the classrooms at Cold Springs. But if a classroom were ready to go, it could become a Child Care Advantage site. Child Care Advantage would help identify a provider to move in, and then that provider would roll with the wait list. But the thing is, the network is really intended to serve providers who are not in a co-located location.
I guess that was my question.
Yeah.
This sounds great if you are a child care provider or prospective provider in central Missoula, but what about an outlying area like Sealy Lake?
Yeah.
You're not going to haul your kids all the way back. Probably not all the way into central Missoula.
Oh, people do.
Well, they might, but that's certainly not desirable.
Do you know how many licensed childcare spots there are in Sealy Lake?
One, not even.
One facility, so 6 slots for children.
So I guess talk to us about the opportunity for something like what we're talking about here, providing back office support for providers in outlying areas.
Yeah, that's what's really exciting, I think, is that we are interested in being able to bring, I say we, I worked for this project for many years now, and so although I'm not there anymore, I still am calling it we.
It's great.
Yeah,
It's great.
It's still we. We would love to see providers from Sealy, from Alberton, from Frenchtown, from all over come into the network because those small in-home providers are the ones who could benefit most from these back office services and also from staying full 100% of the time, right? So the larger a center is, the easier they're able to absorb that loss in income for a little while. And they're also more likely to serve that wider age range.
Is this ready to be scaled up yet? Or when do you think this could happen? Because I'm looking at like Lolo or Frenchtown.
Yeah.
When could they participate?
The goal is to open the network more broadly to other providers around the turn of the year and be bringing in other companies at that point as well so that we have more business members whose employees get that faster access. And then we have more childcare organizations in the network. I will also say that we're really excited because a really dynamic professional, early childhood professional in Hamilton is really interested in establishing a Ravalli Child Care Advantage in Ravalli. And we've been really excited since the beginning about the idea of both expansion all across Missoula County, but also the ability to replicate this model in other places.
Ravalli County is the county to the south of us.
Thank you.
Can we go back? I don't know if this is part of this podcast one way or the other, but to talk about behavior and your coaching days and what's changed, what's missing, what do we need now? How do we tackle this? Because this is an issue. What advice do you have?
Wow, that is a really great question. One of the things that was most challenging for me when I was a center director, which I was for about 8 years, was this question of how to support teachers who were dealing with a child whose behavior was challenging for a variety of reasons, right? Like it's scary, it's frustrating, it pushes all of your buttons. And most people who work in childcare settings, not all obviously, but most are like young women. It's a job you can get with a high school degree. A lot of folks who have always been great with kids, like kids love me kind of thing, want to move into childcare. And then you encounter like that kid, right? Like the first time that you encounter that kid who all of your charm and your charisma and your everything, it's not working. And this kid really causes you to question whether this work is right for you at all. The people who find themselves in that situation desperately need mentors. They desperately need tools and strategies and knowledge. And as I moved into like a coaching and consulting role, I started to work as a coach in a framework of preventing challenging behavior. It turns out there actually are some really amazing experts across the country who have figured out like the keys, the toolkit, and they call it a pyramid model because there are 3 layers to it. Actually, there are 4. The first is the very base, which is like a well-supported workforce, right? So you got to have remember I mentioned first that it's those interactions with adults who aren't stressed.
Are
Right?
there any of those?
Well, it turns out the Surgeon General just recently came out with a report that said that parental stress is a national crisis.
Oh,
So it is true. We have built a system in which parents are deeply stressed, and young people are choosing not to have kids because they can see what's over that horizon for them.
Yeah.
And so parental stress is actually a huge problem. And folks working in childcare facilities who are stressed is a huge problem. That's not a great environment for kids when the adults around them are stressed. Because the next little piece of that pyramid of skills is around building relationships with children. That sounds like a no-brainer, but what about building a relationship with that child?
Ooh, how
Right?
do you do that?
What do you do? It turns out there are lots of things that you can do on purpose every day with intention to build relationships with challenging children. And if you're working with children birth to 5, relationships and care are not like a side effect. They're the core.
Yeah.
That's what you have to pay attention to first, is those pieces. Also, how do you set up the environment? There are lots and lots of environmental strategies. Like, how do you set up your classroom, your space, your childcare environment? How do you set it up to prevent challenges? This was one of my favorite things as a coach, actually, was to go into an environment and kind of like look around and be like, I bet you get a lot of children wrestling right over there. And they would be like, yeah, why? And I'd be like, well, you see how that carpet is running all the way along the room and it's ending at that cute pile of pillows? That's what we call a runway. And if you are 2.5 feet high, that is an invitation you cannot refuse to run and leap into that space. And there are things you can do with your room layout that prevent that behavior from ever happening in the first place, because the way the room is set up is the first teacher. It tells us what's expected, and it tells the child what's expected of them. So there are a lot of strategies around setting up your room to get more of the behaviors that you
Okay,
want
we
to see.
need to remove the pile of pillows at the end of this conference room
I
here.
keep diving into the corner.
Grace, if someone's listening and is fired up about how they could help the work of Montana Advocates for Children or just get more engaged in childcare issues in general, what should they do?
So 2 things that they could do. One, if they're interested in sharing their story about how challenging the childcare environment is as a family right now or as a provider, I would love for them to come to our website at mtadvocatesforchildren.org and sign up to become Montana Advocate for Children. They will get from us an email once a week with just some nuggets and tidbits and resources and links. And then as we roll toward the legislative session or have other opportunities to really try to push on some of those policy levers, that's when we'll be asking people to share their stories, share their voice, because it's those stories that make a huge difference to folks who have the ability to shape change. So I would encourage them to come to our website. If they're interested in finding out more about local solutions, particularly here in Missoula County, I would encourage them to reach out to the coordinator for 0 to 5 Missoula, the newly hired coordinator there who's at United Way, and also to Childcare Advantage and its coordinator, Sally Henkel.
Is there an effect on business when businesses need to attract workers and workers struggle with getting childcare?
I'm so glad that you asked me that question. Childcare is essentially the workforce behind the workforce. So unless you have a robust childcare system that families who need it can access, what ends up happening is that local businesses suffer because folks can't show up to work. I mentioned that women often alter their own work aspirations and stay home with kids when there's not adequate childcare available. Turns out there's a huge economic loss, not only to that family, but also to our communities and to our state when that happens. A couple years ago, the Bureau of Business and Economic Research put out a phenomenal report called Lost Opportunities, the Economic Impact of Inadequate Childcare in Montana. And it's to the tune of millions and millions and millions of dollars lost to our tax base because folks are staying home instead of being in the workforce. Now, everyone should have the choice, but right now people don't.
Right. Grace, per our tradition, and before we close, we always like to ask our guests if you have a good book you've read recently, a nugget of wisdom that you'd like to share with our listeners.
Yeah, well, I think that I might have mentioned it before, but I'm going to go ahead and tell you a little more about it again. It's a book called Holding It Together. I am just a real fan of this book because I think it pulls together a lot of the parts and pieces of our broken, not only childcare system, but really social safety net overall. It's by Jessica Calarco, I think is how you pronounce her last name. It's called Holding It Together. And it is about the way that women hold together our social safety net because we have disintegrated it so much as a society. So when you talk about elder care, or childcare, or actually she goes into many of the other parts and pieces of holding communities together. Women are doing that unpaid and often unrecognized work, and they're doing it in ways that end up having impacts on their own health and certainly on their own economic security and their own futures.
Yeah.
Thanks for that.
Wow.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so
Well, thanks.
much.
Kind of a depressing nugget.
No, that
Thanks not just for the conversation, but for everything you are doing and have done.
Oh, it's so my pleasure. I'm still as passionate about the early years as I've ever been. And I think we have so many folks like yourselves who see that and are working on creative solutions. So it's a really positive time.
Montana's so lucky to have you.
Oh,
Thanks, Grace.
Thank you,
thanks,
Grace.
you guys.
Thanks for listening to The Agenda. If you enjoy these conversations, it would mean a lot if you'd rate and review the show on whichever podcast app you use.
And if you know a friend who would like to keep up with what's happening in local government, be sure to recommend this podcast to them.
The Agenda with the Missoula County Commissioners is made possible with support from Missoula Community Access Television, better known as MCAT, and our staff in the Missoula County Communications Division.
If you have a question or a topic you'd like us to discuss on a future episode, email it to communications@missoulacounty.us.
To find out other ways to stay up to date with what's happening in Missoula County, go to missoula.co/county updates.
Thanks for listening.